land grab is a global process that has been documented through several documents, etc. And it is affecting especially some African and Asian countries. Through a different path, there is also a process of land concentration in Latin America. Recently, FAO, the regional representation of FAO in Santiago de Chile, has documented this process in 17 countries. They have published a very interesting book, and what these studies find is that in almost all Latin American countries there is this concentration of land property, with, of course, some national particularities. In the case, for example, of Argentina and Brazil, we have large tracts of land that have been bought by foreign countries, Korea, Japan, China, etc., and that are used for mainly for soybean production. And in Bolivia, you have also foreign owners of large landholdings, but in the case of Bolivia and also of Paraguay, it is the Brazilians that are the big landowners. And there is, for these two countries, Bolivia and Paraguay, this ownership by Brazilians in the border zones pose a geopolitical issue for the three countries, Brazil, Bolivia, and Paraguay. In the case of Peru, here we have had a very radical land reform in the early 70s, where all big latifundia were expropriated. But since 1995, we have had a process of reconcentration of land, particularly in the coastal region, which has the best land, agricultural land of all the country. By now, almost 1/3 of all the land in the coast is owned by huge farms of more than 1,000 hectares each. Even we have now an enterprise that has near 80,000 hectares. That has never occurred in all the history of Peru. But now we have that size of what we call here now the neo-latifundio, the new latifundios. In other countries you have different ways to arrive to this land concentration. Even in Colombia, where you have a civil war, there have been people that have abandoned their land, and this land have been captured by groups of people that are related to already other big landowners, and they have appropriated of this abandoned land. There are some characteristics that should be underlined in all this relatively new process of land concentration. One is that the new owners are not the old hacendados that before that were predominant in the 60s and 50s and before, but we have now huge corporations that have diversified economic interests. They are in the world of finance, of real estate, of fisheries, mining, etc. And these investments in agriculture is just one of their economic platform. Another characteristic is that in the recent decades there are what we can call now the translatinas, which are transnational firms that are based in Latin American countries. So we have in Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile, in Colombia, and also in Peru, huge companies that own other companies in Latin America. So that is also a new characteristic of these land owners. And a third characteristic is that you do not need to have property, land property, to control the land. Through other ways you can access to land. We have one of the most interesting examples are these called pools in Argentina. They control even 1 million hectares, especially on soybean production. Through leases, they just organize the production, they fund the production, they manage it, they sell the production, but they don't own any land. So there are many different ways that are developing to control land. Now, what are some of the social and even political impacts of this process? For one thing, inequality, which is a characteristic of many of our Latin American countries, is being deepened by this concentration. Now, what had in countries as Peru had disappeared in the last decades after the land reform, this bipolar agricultural structure, it has reborn again. So you have on one side the big land holdings, the neolatifundios, and you have on the other side millions of minifundia or family farmers. So you have again this division, which has been in the past a source of social conflicts. Another impact is that these corporations that own land have a disproportionate influence in local governments. They own thousands of hectares and have a very, very strong peso. How do you say peso?
Weight.
They have a very strong weight in the decisions that are taken by municipalities and by regional governments. And that has to do with the democratization of the rural areas. And also another impact is that almost all this land that is concentrated is dedicated to the exports or to biofuels, to the production of biofuels. So you will have there a problem of competition with land that is dedicated to food production. So you have some current problems, and you have also problems in perspective that are a direct result of this land concentration. I should mention the last impact is that by default the policies, the official policies that support and promote this big agro-business for exportation, by default that means that there are no policies for support of family farming or for middle-sized farmers, which are the main producers of food, that they sustain food security in our countries. So there is also this has an impact also for the rural development policies. There are very scarce resources that are dedicated really for rural development. So finally, this process of concentration, of land concentration, as a way of modernization of our agriculture, are almost in contradictory paths, referring to rural developments. What are the reasons behind this land grabbing? For one thing, you have to consider external factors. Since the 90s, there has been a dynamization of international economy. Densely populated regions as China and India have developed, their population have increased their capacity for buying more food and food that is more expensive. So there is a growing demand of food in the world. And internally, Latin American countries have adopted since the 1990s neoliberal policies that included the liberalization of land markets and of some rules of the games that favor big investments and that are not friendly for small investors, small producers, etc. In the 1990s, for example, all the Andean countries, they changed their laws on land, liberalizing it and reducing or eliminating the obstacles for land markets. And some of other countries also signed free trade agreements, which further liberalized the economy and guaranteed in the future that these liberalizing policies won't change. You know? So all these were conditions that favored the land concentration. Now, how to prevent this if one accepts that this new concentration is a source of conflicts, of inequality, of injustice in land distribution, etc.? Well, it is not, of course, very easy because, as I was saying before, these landowners, new landowners, are not new hacendados. They are corporations, so they are very strong. They have a very strong influence on public matters. They have very strong lobbies. And finally, after some years, they are also intermingled with the regional economics, the economies of the regions. So it is not very easy to change the situation in a radical way. There have been some intents as Bolivia. Bolivia, for example, has forbidden any farm to own more than 5,000 hectares. But finally, if the owners are 5, you can multiply 5 times 5,000, so you can have 25 hectares. So there are different ways in which these economic interests can go around the laws that try to put restrictions to land concentration. In other countries, as in Brazil and Argentina, and I believe also recently in Uruguay, there are policies that pretend to reduce the foreign investments in land, which are very obvious. These investments are very obvious in Argentina and in Brazil, also in the southern part of Chile, parts of Uruguay and Paraguay. So there are some norms that are being issued that puts restrictions to foreign ownership of land. And there are some initiatives also to put progressive taxes to land in order to desestimulate the concentration of land property. In some countries you have already some laws in that sense, but that have not been implemented because of resistance of the landowners and because of the weakness of the governments and of the lack of political decisions. So currently in our Latin American countries you couldn't say that there are real policies that restrict the concentration of land. There are discussions, there are initiatives, but nothing really definitive in these matters.